Frankly, I wouldn't applaud until you've heard what they'd said. Let's start with you, Excellency. I heard your opening remarks. Now tell us what we need to do. What's the number one thing we need to address to get that solution to the problem you eloquently stated?
I think we should be more practical to start with. And what I meant by that, and I've been saying this for quite some time, the difference between corporations and governments most of the time is corporations, to large extents, they use practicality, they use data, information, analysis to come to a conclusion. And then a recommendation, then they start doing what they're doing. All of us in here, that's what we do. That's how we roll. The problem that I see most of the time with most of the governments is they're starting with a certain ideology. And this ideology would come to a final recommendation, and then they will work backward. So what I'm trying to say in here, the more practical we are addressing the problems that we have, we can have the right solutions.
Doesn't practicality, Patrice, doesn't practicalities involve hard decisions?
Absolutely. In fact, the decisions that have the most dramatic and the most impactful changes requires implementation, and often you've got to take the decisions that aren't popular. But from a medium to long-term perspective, are these essential decisions that lead to the long-term prosperity of humanity.
David, thinking of that difference between long-term, medium-term, and short-term, I'm thinking of the changes you've just made at Goldman, where the reorganization, where again, you're balancing multiple constituencies over different time or time parameters. And that's one of the complexities we have at the moment. It was always thus, but it's got worse.
Well, certainly the small and relatively insignificant changes we made at the firm in terms of how we organized it are very different than the topics, Richard, you're pushing on here. You know, when you talk about decisions, I think about it through the lens of policy. You know, we operate in a world where we make policy decisions or we execute under certain policy initiatives, and they ultimately have long-term impacts. You don't see the impacts of those things sometimes for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. For example, now, we're living in an environment where, at least from a monetary policy perspective, the decisions we've made over the last 40 years, we're now in the process of unwinding, you know, a multi-decade period, and there are consequences to that. And so I think it's just very important as you think ahead, you think about the right policy actions that you can take. This comes, you know, largely from government. It's got to be influenced by the private sector, but the right policy actions that you can take so that when you look back 5, 10, 15 years from now, you know, we've made progress against some of these issues.
So what do you focus on when making those decisions? I mean, you can only influence the macro stuff to a certain extent, but how do you, what are you focused at the moment on in making your decisions?
At what am I focused on?
Yes.
I'm focused on the macro environment, making decisions for our firm, our company, or are you asking broader, what should someone, if somebody was taking policy action, what should they be focused on? I want to make sure I understand what you're asking, Richard.
I'll come back to that.
Okay.
Jamie, I was surprised, but not really, at the amount of coverage when you said recently you foresaw a recession in the US, which seemed to me like sort of a, you know, you were saying what everybody had thought or feared. How bad do you think it's going to get?
Yeah, so welcome everybody, thrilled to be here, and you know, I think it's very important we all make long-term decisions. So I literally look at the, you know, some of these things. We manage risk, we build people, systems, technology, looking, like David said, 5 or 10 or 15 years out. And my recession comment was related to what Ray said. It's very good news right now in the United States. People see it, consumers, businesses, still spending, still lots of money, a lot of fiscal stimulus. But there's a lot of stuff on the horizon, which is bad, and doesn't necessarily, but could put the United States in a recession. That's not the most important thing for what we think about. we'll manage right through that. I would worry much more about the geopolitics of the world today.
You worried about the geopolitics. Which side of the geopolitics particularly?
I think the most important thing is the geopolitics, what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, America, China, the relationships of the Western world, and that would have me far more concerned than whether there's a mild or slightly severe recession. Let's
take the energy issues resulting from the war in Ukraine. Catherine MacGregor, you've made huge strides to diversify away from Russian gas. There's only so far you can go. There is an unenviable and undeniable reality. It will remain. Are we in for a very hard winter in Europe?
Okay, so hello everybody, very nice to be here. So situation on security of supply in Europe is something that we've been working extremely hard since actually even before the war broke up. So security of supply was something that we worked on very hard. We use all the levers, infrastructure, LNG import, of course, storage. And today, the situation for this winter is actually quite comfortable from a gas standpoint. I think what is important always is to think of our energy system as one system. So you have to think of gas, you have to think of electricity. And here there is, a 10 system. So every action counts. So it's around security of supply of the gas side. It's also the electricity systems. And I think in the long term, of course, accelerating the energy transition, which is truly part of the solution of the energy security of supply issue.
Has it given us a wake-up call in the sense that we've got the short-termism of can we get through the winter with the stocks, and if so, how and why? Then you've got the medium term, well, how can we diversify? And then you've got the long term, which is what do we do? We seem to have taken a step backwards in a sense.
It is a massive wake-up call, I think a welcome wake-up call, because we were very busy thinking how we decarbonize our energy system. Now we see, look, it's not just that. You also have to guarantee the security of supply and affordability with all the social implication that this issue has, and you can see that dimension is very, very important. Now, the good news in my mind is that some of the things that we were already engaged in, energy transition, massive investment in renewable energy, contributes to the solution because you have locally produced energy almost on an infinite basis. Of course, you also have to work on the resiliency of your system, which renewable only will not do. So you have to think of a system, make sure that you have all the bricks. We heard earlier about storage, of course, the gas component, how to decarbonize the gas. Every bricks is going to be very important, but system resiliency is going to be absolutely critical.
Taking the shortages and taking the difficulties, Sara, the food emergency that's as a result of the war, a lot of people woke up to the reality of the food crisis and realized for the first time there were vast swathes of the world that we're going to be in deep trouble. Are we out of that trouble yet?
I think the first thing to clarify is that the war did not start the food crisis. It added fuel to an already burning fire. We had some pretty big structural changes occur in our food systems. I mean, our food systems have been fragile for a very long time. We've been talking about food security since the 70s. When Henry Kissinger coined the term. So we haven't really gone a long way. Our systems have been really fragile. In early 2020, we had major structural changes happen. The first is structural changes to demand, which came out of China, which became a net importer of grains. China had not been a net importer of cereal grains for a long time. You then had a series of climate-related disruptions on the supply side, which had led to prices to rally. So the Russia-Ukraine war added fuel to that fire as opposed to starting it. And I think this is probably the biggest thing to identify here because it doesn't go away if the war stopped tomorrow. So if you look at...
So what do we need to do? I know there's no magic bullet, but if you talk to policy, what's the key that's going to unlock this?
Well, the first thing is I think we have to adjust our capital markets and how we fund our food systems and our agricultural systems. So By background, I used to be an energy trader before I went into the agricultural world. And the example I give is, if an oil and gas producer came and wanted to hedge 2 to 3 years forward in the early 2000s, that was hard. Then you actually had the ability to produce 10-year hedges, 15-year hedges, et cetera, which led to a lot of innovation. If you look at our food systems and our agricultural markets today, and you look at the most liquid market in the world, which is corn in the United States, selling 2 years forward is still a miracle. Most things are negotiated day to day, week to week. So until we can restructure and rethink what capital markets actually look like, it's not just a policy thing, it's also a business thing.
Steve Schwarzman, good to see you, sir. The restructuring of markets, and indeed the restructuring of the financial plumbing, if you will, to account for this new global order, can it take place? Does it need a shove to help it take place?
Well, I think, Richard, financial markets function quite well. I don't know that there's a need for enormous restructuring. That happened after the global financial crisis with massive amounts of more capital, going into the banking system. The problems that we all face on this panel are problems of relationships among countries, higher interest rates, the difficulties that are going to be going forward. One of the things that we're almost not aware of is how difficult it is for governments to function in a world of social media. Almost every initiative that somebody tries to do to make the world better is undercut by some minority shouting down those people who are trying to accomplish something for the benefit of the world. And that's an underlying utility function that's now been institutionalized. And unless we address that in some way so that people can actually do their jobs, we're going to have a lot of difficulty.
How do you do that? I mean, you've set out a problem, but that's a reality. Social media's here. A policy is going to be announced. It's going to be attacked in some sort of way. So how do you tackle that problem?
Well, it's interesting. I did a big donation in the AI area at MIT, and they had an opening where some of the people who actually started the internet were there. Some were Nobel Prize winners, and most of them said, and I was quite surprised, that they were spending their time trying to undo what they did, and that it was an idea to basically move scientific data around the world in a costless, immediate way, which they thought was, in effect, a really neat trick to do.
Right.
But what happened is it went wrong. And even though we all love getting our emails, that's a lot of fun. We're all instantly on all the time, no matter where we are. The underlying destabilization of the modern world is a reality. And I don't know how to fix it. Some of them are trying to do it. We're going to need different standards for sort of written word, different ways to create balance. We can't just allow things to roll ahead the way we're doing, because it's really becoming very dysfunctional.
Very dysfunctional, Jamie, and then to you, Khaldoon, then to you, Ray. Yes.
I have a suggestion, which I probably shouldn't say. When you enter social media, they should authentify who you are. It'll get rid of all the bots, all the fake emails, all the chat. It'll make you legal under law of the land. They should authentify the way you are, just like you enter a banking system. And number two, they should give you a menu of choices for how you want to be, what algorithm you want to use. Here's our algorithm, here's one that favors this, here's one that favors that. They should give you a choice as opposed to manipulating you.
What would you choose?
I don't look at any of that crap.
Khaldoon,
All right, I'm not going to answer a question. Maybe let me just.
are you, you got your microphone?
Sorry?
I don't think you've got
Is it
it.
working?
Well, I can't hear. Carry on. Keep going.
Okay. So, first of all, I want to thank Yasir. The way this day has been constructed is a lovely build-up. By reminding us to start with the great panel this morning of Nobel laureates, to remind us all here before we sit on this session about humanity and the importance of investing in humanity. So I think that's a nice setup for the next step, where then Ray gave us I think a rude awakening, something we all know, of the challenges that we all face around the world today. The gathering here is a fantastic gathering. You see people east, west, north, south, from all over the world. And now we have this board meeting, mock board meeting, which I think when we're talking about the challenges of the world, 3 principles come to my mind, just in this mock board meeting.
Right.
Number 1, transparency. It's a lovely group here of esteemed colleagues, wise colleagues, I hope, and we are talking transparently with a gathering of people from all over the world around us. Transparency is very important when you're trying to solve problems. 2, empathy. We have to be empathetic. It's a very valuable word that unfortunately is not appreciated well enough, empathy. 3rd, inclusion. I think we do a decent enough on inclusion, but let's remind ourselves, we're missing about 2.5 billion people on this table. I think we need someone from India. I think we need someone from China. I think to really have a truly inclusive group. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, transparency, empathy, and inclusion are all admirable ideas and thoughts, but they go along with sort of apple pie and motherhood. Nobody can disagree with you. The issue is how you get there.
I think we're all globalists here. Well, I'll speak on behalf of this board.
Does anybody deny being a globalist?
Globalists, are we?
No, carry on.
I think we're. Yeah. Now, globalization, which we all have been part of over these 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Sorry, globalization is the policy that has now left a large section of the world worried about food.
Well, a form of globalization. I think there is a shift towards deglobalization right now, and we all see also the challenges that deglobalization creates. My view, and I think maybe I leave it on the table right now, I think there needs to be some sort of grounds here where there's a form of globalization that helps address some of these challenges without going down this slippery slope of deglobalization and the impacts that we're already seeing of this shift and of this break.
Ray, is the system capable of that?
Yeah, I think if you just look at, start, what are the existential risks, okay? The existential risk is fighting with each other. What you need, I think, is a strong middle, strong political middle, a strong middle that is stronger than the extremes. And I think that if you deal with there's an existential risk of dealing with that problem domestically. For example, I won't go at length, but a president who's president of all the people, who has a bipartisan cabinet and can draw together to do a restructuring. You need a restructuring of the system because I'm sure this is going to be misunderstood, but the profit system has to produce the objective in which there's better equal opportunity and all that. The second thing is there's an existential risk of war, international war. So when we deal with that existential risk of international war, if there was the objective of establishing a mechanism by which that will not happen and red lines will exist, then we will maintain peace and thoughtfulness. There's a lot of good things going on. The good things have to do with innovation. All of us are exposed to incredible amounts of innovation that can go on. If that can go on in a peaceful environment so that it produces productivity. We will continue to raise our living standards if we can remain peaceful and empathy, mutual consideration, thinking about the whole, and produce productivity rather than produce waste. I think those are the things that are conceivable of how to do it. I don't know anybody who is talking about doing it that way, but yes, there's a way.
But the idea, David, of a sort of a middle, a coalesced middle, a bipartisanship, we are so far from that I cannot see, and perhaps you can give us your thoughts, how do you get there? I mean, the UK managed to nearly blow up its economy because of extremes. The US has the midterms coming up. Everybody seems to agree that geopolitical is the key issue. How do you get there?
I think it's a hard journey, and we've been in this place before. Somehow we have a resiliency that when we're under pressure, we find ways to get to a better place. And maybe we're at a point in time here where, somehow, as we look through some of the division that exists in governments around the world, we can find some catalyst that'll allow us to move in a positive direction. Ray was just talking about something I think is very important. We can sit up here and talk about all the things that are headwinds to growth, to success, to bringing people along. But the innovation economy in this world is alive and well. The progress that's being made on a whole variety of fronts, whether it's AI and quantum, whether it's med tech and advances in healthcare that are going to have a profound impact on the way we live and the way we keep people healthy, those advances, that ecosystem is very, very powerful. And by the way, that has an ability to lift us up and move us forward. So somehow we have a system. It's not perfect. You talk about globalization. Globalization's done a lot of things right. I don't personally believe in deglobalization, but rather I believe in a moment when there's a lot of tension, people start thinking strategically about certain things in ways they haven't thought for the last few decades. They think more strategically about energy supplies. They think more strategically about food. They think more strategically about chips. They think strategically about things they need. And that's a little bit of a reversal from globalization, but it's not a deglobalization trend.
But if you look, David, then Patrice, if you look at the current difficulties that we're facing, and particularly financial difficulties that are likely to last several years as we unwind the decade of cheap money and so forth, is it difficult to convince publics, to populations, that we are on the right track when they see such lurches? I mean, let's take US interest rates, which are going to go to the high. There's an entire generation of population that's never seen that level of interest rate before. Now, people around this table have seen much higher.
Yeah, I don't think, Richard, we're unwinding 10 years. I think we're unwinding 40 years. I think, candidly, we privatized fixed income. We nationalized fixed income markets around the world for a variety of reasons. Central banks nationalized fixed income markets, and we're now going through a process of privatizing them again. And that's disruptive. I mean, as Jamie said, if we have a significant recession in the US or elsewhere in the world, we will work through that. But as we work through and we think about where we are, different kinds of decisions will have to be made to get different results when you look 5 to 10 years forward. And that's something that takes time. There aren't easy answers. There's not a silver bullet. It takes time to work through. And it takes adjustment. And candidly, we're going through an adjustment after a very long period of time of the world, at least from a macro or a monetary policy perspective, working a certain way.
On that point, Governor, the issue of working through will be painful. And populations, citizens, will become disillusioned. And not surprisingly, there is a large number of people who say, the system did not work for me. Therefore, we either go extreme or we check out. That's a concern.
I mean, checking out is not a solution. Extreme is not a solution, too.
But there are risks.
Of course. Like anything else in life, there are always risks, right? So I think doing one's part is the most important thing. Ray mentioned different types of wars, right? in the earlier session. And the problem is, globalization and the geo-economics is happening now because of weaponizing some of the things that we shouldn't be touching. What happened between many countries by banning, certain products and services and these kind of things, instead of the expansion in the economies that we have witnessed in the past 2 decades, now we're going backward instead of moving forward. Every country now has to have its full supply chain.
So how?
Otherwise, it's not going to work out. So what we, let's say in here in Saudi, we want to have at least a minimum of 65% of our supply chain in a local content. And that's part of the Vision 2030 that we mentioned. So, but going back to one of the comments that I heard earlier today, which is the hummingbird. We should all have the hummingbird, and to Khaldoon's earlier comments, empathy.
65%. If every country, Patrice, aims for 65% of the supply chain domestically, what happens?
Well, every country, as a starting point, has to look at what's in the best interest of its citizens. But there can be no doubt that globalization, to encourage trade, to encourage countries to build partnerships that are mutually beneficial, to encourage global companies to do business in countries that are competitive, I think that's very, very important. We have to create a world order where there's the promotion and advancement of mutual interest.
How do you do that? Now, I'm going to pause you there because to say we have to create a global order that does that, nobody can disagree with you. Now tell me how we do it.
Well, I think business has a critical role to play. What we've learned in the developing world is you should not leave a lot of what needs to be done in the hands of governments. I mean, governments are more inclined to look at what is popular and what will give them votes. We have to take long-term views and long-term perspectives. So what is critically important is this fragmentation. I think business has to encourage a greater cooperation, partnerships between businesses worldwide. And the final point is, I think there's a duty on all of us. We have to engage our governments and encourage our governments to work towards a global order that encourages more cooperation, that encourages more partnerships and more investments.
We're going
That's what's good for business.
Arguably, some governments are going in the opposite direction. Catherine.
Yeah, maybe to talk a little bit about the energy as not a bad proxy, actually, for this new global order. And if you try to project a little bit, you can see that new order settling into a 3-tier system where you have much more self-reliance. So depending on, obviously, each country, you have more local production. And then you have a regional integration, really important to give you some breathing space and beware of the insularity. You see what happened in Texas a couple of years ago. You see France used to be exporter of electricity, right now is importing electricity. So regional integration is really important to give you that resiliency already for your system. And then the international layer, a global market that continues to work. I can see today the value of LNG. Europe, for example, in 2022, will rely on energy for about 32%, which was 19% just last year, so huge increase in LNG. Now we need to find, of course, the future LNG. Is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be a derivative from hydrogen? Here, obviously, the jury is still out, but the ability to continue to be sharing one commodity, one molecule, in my mind, is going to be very important as part of this energy system. It will be very, very important.
I've interviewed over the last few weeks numerous, numerous representatives of Ukrainian energy minister, Ukrainian energy providers, while the bombs are dropping, destroying Ukraine's electrical system. The disparity between the reality and the hope is so huge. And then, of course, you do get this moments of hope where Jordan and Israel, for example, finally agreeing, Lebanon and Israel finally agreeing a border for their gas in the sea. So I have difficulty squaring this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're right to point out to the challenge of this regional integration being the infrastructure. So you need to have the grid and you have to have the infrastructure. And I think moments like this are good opportunities to review our infrastructure interconnectivity. I see good discussions happening today, so I have hope.
You have hope?
Of course, that's my job. I'm a CEO.
Do you all have hope? Sarah? I mean, be honest.
Depends on the day of the week. You know, there are times when you sort of look at the power of innovation, right? And David touched on it, which is we are able to create meaningful institutions in records amount of time now, and things that can transform systems, right? So when there's a will, there's much more of a way, and there's capital for it today than there ever was before. The flip side is, I think, you have a highly fragmented world, and you look at it really anywhere in the world, and you ask the question, what happens when you sort of build self-reliance for 65% of your supply chain? The answer is if you're a poor country, you get poorer, because it is really difficult to do that at scale and do it at a cost-effective way. And so I think one of the things that worries me personally is actually as we move to a world that is insular because we don't trust one another, we are building mechanisms and systems that might actually create greater inequality. So, like I said, it depends on...
Well, that means we're going backwards.
Yes, we have gone backwards. We have, in the last 6 months, more people have entered poverty than the number of people China took out of poverty for the last 2 decades. So yes, I mean, I think it's okay to acknowledge that we have taken a huge step backwards as humanity and as society. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we rebuild? And we don't rebuild if we don't trust. If politicians don't trust one another, if businesses don't trust one another, if politicians don't trust businesses, there is a broken system that we need to rebuild. And trust is where it starts.
So trying to take that point, Jamie, if we look now, because really what you're all talking about, and you've been quite open about, is geopolitical risk and geostrategic issues. For you, Jamie, which is the most significant in the world at the moment?
It's Russia, Ukraine, and the effect it has on the relationship of America and China. I think you have to take a step back here. The world and mankind, and Ray mentioned, has been getting better and better century after century after century in terms of life, people not living in poverty, people not in childbirth, not dying in childbirth, et cetera. And that trend isn't stopping yet. I think February 24th was a massive pivot change in the world. It kind of woke us up. This illusion that the Western world had that somehow peace is at hand and you don't have to really worry about it, that was a mistake. And around that immediately is, national security, is energy security, is food security. And it's perfectly reasonable that countries say, how can I protect myself by diversifying my supply chains, et cetera. But at the root of all this, in my view, is American leadership. If you don't have strong American leadership, and not ugly American leadership, not our way or the highway, but just as a coalescing thing for the Western world, you're going to have chaos like you've seen in Ukraine. And this nuclear blackmail is probably the worst thing that we've seen in our lifetimes. And it's also teaching the rest of the world it's okay. So if we're not sitting here in a couple hundred years, it'll be nuclear proliferation. It's not going to be climate change. And I think we've got to be very careful how we view that kind of thing. And I think for America to do it right, I'm going to go back to what Khaldoon said. I think the world lost a lot by not traveling for 2 years. I mean, I think it's important to sit down. I had a wonderful dinner last night with people I've known here for 15 or 20 years, and how much you learn and you listen and you respond. So the American policy doesn't have to be everything our way. You could protect the Japanese rice farmer. You can learn from the rest of the world. Apprenticeship programs in Switzerland and Germany work. Okay, the carbon tax in Ireland works. There are a lot of people who have infrastructure that works. There are a lot of people they're both protecting oil and gas and they're doing solar, and it works. And so I have hope we'll do that. It's going to take a little bit of work.
Right, but when you get tensions between allies and friends, such as Saudi and the United States, over energy and OPEC, that doesn't help, however deep those tensions may be in reality versus of the moment. That doesn't help creating a stability.
What doesn't help is the press making huge deals about things which aren't huge deals. So, Saudi Arabia and the United States have been allies for 75 years. I can't imagine any allies agreeing on everything and not having problems. They'll work it through. And I'm comfortable that folks on both sides will work it through and that these countries will remain allies going forward and hopefully help the world develop and grow properly.
It will be much more difficult, Steve Schwarzman, thank you. It'll be much more difficult for the US and China, knowing your great interest in China, the US and China to find common ground if Xi continues the direction he appears to be going as a result of the recent party congress.
So you've thrown a hot potato
So we're happy you did.
And everybody else is looking relieved for a second. Patrice, it's coming to you next.
I think a lot of the problems that we're dealing with at the moment come from unexpected impact of COVID and the pandemic. When you don't see other people, you don't meet other people, which we all used to do. And this makes this conference really useful because all of a sudden you're seeing people again. But I realized that over the last few weeks, I'm seeing my first visitors from Asia. China's been effectively closed for 3 years. And what happens in any set of human relations when you don't basically communicate with people, then they're left to their own devices. And it doesn't matter what kind of culture you're in. So I think that, we have a U.S. group that's sort of has a certain set of beliefs. We have China, which is reacting to some of that, and we've gotten ourselves into a situation that's increasingly deglobalized.
Right.
And behind that curtain, the only way you change that is you have to have people actually seeing each other without calling each other, in effect, names. That is not how you create a functional environment. And I think that we need to go back, sort of a fresh start, if you will, and sit down and talk about, what's on everybody's mind, rather than everyone thinking they understand what's on somebody else's mind.
Okay.
And acting on that basis.
Patrice, Africa's in the middle there. Another hot potato, it's coming your way. Africa's in the middle of this US-China who you want to be friends with, isn't it?
Well, we want to be friends with everybody.
And that usually means ending up being friends with no one.
And we need, I think Jamie's correct. Jamie raised something very important. It's in the interest of America to have a good relationship with Saudi. And there's been this historic relationship between Saudi and America, so there's a huge mutual interest. We trade approximately $200 billion every year with China. $400 billion of trade between Africa and Europe, about $100 and $150 billion worth of trade with America. It's beneficial for us, the African continent, it's beneficial for the developing world. And I think our position is very clear. We want a very strong, mutually beneficial relationship with China. We want an equally very strong, mutually beneficial relationship with America, with Saudi, and with Europe. We're not going to allow ourselves to be in a position where we're going to choose one at the expense of the other.
Oh, I know you don't want to choose, but the reality, Excellency, the reality is, distasteful though it is, in this current war, Russia-Ukraine, that Jamie has rightly identified, countries are being forced to choose, and those who do not, those who are not my friends are my enemy.
So, I think...
Or at least not my friend.
So, Richard, I think the last 3 years, we've seen two anomalous black swan events that have impacted every country, every person on earth, in one way. It's quite remarkable, really, of what we've seen in the last 3 years, and the repercussions of these two, one being COVID and obviously the war. These two events and the repercussions of what we're seeing from these two events, we're still, I think, coming to grips with them. We didn't get out of COVID yet. We're still finding our way out of COVID. Some countries have not left COVID, as you all know. So that reset post-COVID, combined with, I think, this energy crisis, and by the way, let's be clear, the energy crisis was happening anyway. It's just kind of sped up due to the events of this year. But the challenge, sorry, I'm going to superimpose another maybe concept into this, which is, this cancel culture. 3 years ago, if we were in this conference, the word hydrocarbon was, evil. The energy transition, we all agree, I think, well, I feel strongly, the climate challenge is the biggest challenge. And the energy transition is happening. But I also believe that hydrocarbons are part of the solution. Having the COP, the one in England, was it 26 or 25, and telling the energy industry, stay out. Stay out. A lot of the challenges we're facing today when it comes to the energy supply are caused by lack of investment created by the inability to many of the financiers, many of the investment institutions, many of the energy companies to invest in critical supply chains that would have, in effect, helped elevate a big part of the problem we're dealing with today. So the energy problem was happening anyway. I think what's sped up as a result, obviously, of the events of this year. So I think, listen, we cannot deny we are in a very difficult crisis from a global perspective. And in my view, it takes, in many occasions, a crisis to work yourself out of it and to start resetting some of the issues that created the crisis to start with. You have to hit a wall. And I think, whether we are going to a recession or not from a global perspective, there's no doubt there's a reset that is absolutely necessary, and I think is going to be happening within the next 12 to 24 months.
How bad?
Sorry?
How bad?
I think it depends on where you are and where you're sitting. Bad in one continent is different than bad in another continent. I think when you look at inflation, all you have to look at inflation as an example. And I know it's that we're not going to talk about inflation, but the reality.
Well, since you've raised
inflation, some places 3%, other places 11%, and some places at 100%. So it's different how this is hitting everywhere in the world. So the solution is not a one size fit all.
Where do you think we are, David Solomon, in the process of normalizing both? Obviously, there's a tightening policy. If not coordinated, a collaborated tightening policy at the moment in all the advanced economies. So where do you think we are in that process?
We're in the process. It's different in different parts of the world. There's no question that economic conditions, in my opinion, economic conditions are going to tighten meaningfully from here. I think in the United States, particularly in the last week or two, there's been a clear message from the Fed that they're going to get to the current path target of 4.5%, 4 3/4, and then pause because there's a lag effect to all of this. But if they don't see real changes, labor is still very, very tight. They're obviously just playing with the demand side by tightening, but if they don't see real changes in behavior, my guess is they'll go further. And I think generally when you find yourself in an economic scenario like this where inflation is embedded, it's very hard to get out of it without a real economic slowdown. So I too am in the camp that we likely have a recession in the US, going to have, I think, most likely a recession. We might be in a recession in Europe. And so until you get to that point that you see a change, whether it's in labor, the demand side, you're going to see central banks continue to move on that trajectory.
Jamie?
I agree.
Thank you. We can go and have coffee. You agree. Where do you think we are in the process?
6 months away from finding out.
And this next 6 months, Larry Summers, speaking to Wolf, put it beautifully, the dilemma of the Fed. He described it like the hotel plumbing in an old hotel. You turn the hot water on, and it doesn't come through, so you turn it a bit more, and it doesn't come through, and you turn it a bit more, and it doesn't come through, and then eventually the hot water comes through scalding. That's what it is with interest rates and policy at the moment.
Yeah.
That's the difficulty.
Yeah, and they're going to find out. I agree with David. They'll take a pause at one point. Conditions around the world to tighten. It's rational to take a pause because any 3 months doesn't matter that much. But American consumers, eventually, the excess money they have is running out. That'll probably happen sometime mid-year next year, and then we'll know more about what's going on with oil and gas prices and all that kind of thing. So we'll find out.
On this question of the global tightening, if you will, for you, I mean, you just raised a bond, a green bond. You're doing a lot with green. Investment decisions as a result of a tightening, a more difficult environment, or what for you, sir?
For the Public Investment Fund, we have different mandates. One of the main mandates that we have is to deploy investments in the domestic economy. So we said we're going to deploy $40 to $50 billion an annual basis on not only green projects, but greenfield projects that would have an impact on the economy. So we're looking at our bottom line, so that's one. We're looking at the economic multiplier, what good these projects will do to the economy, what kind of jobs it will create, the quality of these jobs and the quantity of these jobs. Then, of course, we have the international investments that we do with most of the people around this table and in this room. And again, it should have an impact. And the impact that I'm talking about, it's in addition to, trying to mitigate the concerns, for instance, that Sara has, how we can look and continue in the transition for the energy, but at the same time, not harm the world.
So how do you do that without getting caught up in all the geopolitical stuff that we've been talking about?
The geopolitical stuff it's a fact. That's what's happening right now, today, in the world. So you have to have the right partners, but you have to invest in yourself, going back to the local content that everyone should have, going back to the kind or types of force that human being had historically and still having until today. So it's a combination. You cannot take one end versus the other. You should work in the middle.
Just maybe a comment on the availability of making investment decisions these days. And we always say for investment decision, you need stability. You need fiscal stability. You need regulatory fiscality. And what is happening post this war is that market design questions are many. People and governments are talking about and actually implementing and doing market interventions measures. They are disrupting quite a bit the fiscal stability of the system, which really poses some interesting challenges for us as industrial investors, particularly on the energy side. So I think it's going to be very important that we try to overcome the current short-term hurdles and start to anticipate how this will all settle down so we can have more visibility and more stability on market designs, fiscal regimes, so we can go back to doing our business.
Ray Dalio, stability. Lovely idea, isn't it? Not seen very often. I mean, let's take the UK. Hardly stable.
I think you have to understand the mechanics, the cause effect. It's a very basic thing. When you produce a larger deficit, you have to sell your bonds. You have to know who the buyers of the bonds are. If you don't have enough buyers of the bonds, you're going to have a buyer's strike, so they're going to sell off. And this is, I think what happened in the UK is a canary in the coal mine. That if you take what's happening in Europe as a whole, the level of interest rates relative to the level of the inflation rates, and the terrible choice that has to be made about if you raise interest rates, what does that mean to Italy's debt service payments? Who is going to make up that difference? There's just mechanics to this. So I think that we are in a situation generally where there's not coordination. You could take the monetary policy of Japan and it'd be totally different monetary policy. And so, but there's still a trade-off because the bonds are going to go down in value because they're not going to own them. Now the question is, do they go down in value because the currency goes down in value or because the bond price goes down in value? But one way or another, they're going to go down in value. And so the interest rate, the interest rate now with all of this debt and how it's been structured when all money was free and interest rates were low, now an interest rate that is high enough to deal with inflation and also high enough to provide an adequate return for the bond investor is too high of an interest rate for the debtor. So now we have that structural trade-off. And the dominoes are falling in a very, very classic way. For example, if you take high-yield investing, they were called high yield before they were, and therefore risky, before you had an interest rate change. Now you had the risk-free rate go up to 4%, and you have the credit spreads go up to 5%. Now they have a 9% interest rate. That won't work for those. So they are going to they're going to be the first ones to go, and you have this series of dynamics. That's the mechanics.
The fall of the dominoes has started?
Yeah, you can see the fall of the dominoes starting. You could see it as like, who has the cash? How much cash do you have that are going to get you through? Are you going to have a year or 2 or 3, or don't you have the cash? So I can go on at length, but each of those dominoes, and the dominoes usually fall in the same kind of ways, and they're falling in the same kind of ways. Jamie mentioned they're 9 months. That's a reasonable time frame. If you take a look at the cash flows and you watch those things, that's what it looks like.
I really don't want to end on a down note of dominoes falling. We are here at the end of the year, as we looked forward to 2023. There's a holiday season in many parts of the world of different faiths about to begin. So imagine I am, for whatever purpose, the fairy godmother, and I have at my hand a wand where I can grant you one wish. One wish. Now, it's got to be a practical wish. It can't be peace in the world. But I can change one thing for you. I'm stalling to give you time to think of something good.
Yeah.
Are we starting with you?
I remember this saying. I don't know who said it. I think it was Confucius. He said something like, if you don't know where your destination is, there are no favorable winds. We should know what is exactly that we want to achieve.
Right.
Unfortunately, the world today doesn't know what they want to achieve.
So what's your wish that I can grant for you?
For me, it's very easy. I have Vision 2030. I want to achieve it.
Is that what?
His Vision 2030.
I think even my wand is going to need a bit more power than that. Steve, what's your one wish that you would like me to grant you? And practical, not... Yeah, let's keep it practical, like the excellency.
Well, Richard, it would be great if you had that power. But I'd wish for normalization of international and domestic relations.
Catherine, I can grant you one wish.
Strong European unity, particularly on energy matters. Strong leadership from Europe on energy matters.
I said I could grant a wish, not a miracle. Strong leadership. David, one wish.
Strong U.S. leadership in sending certain messages around the world to help create a framework so we can all work together and move forward.
Khaldoon, your one wish. I can come back to you.
I'm struggling to understand your definition because that's a very also quite a ambitious target. You just accept it as a wish.
Oh, but it is.
Yeah,
Aim high.
I'm going to go more ambitious. I'm going to say peace and stability in the world, and I'm going to stand by that because you're a magician. You can give these wishes.
I'll allow it you on this occasion. Ray, one wish.
Well, I think yours is the great starting point because, and so what are those things? Those things, and I'm sorry, I won't go on. But in other words, I think we want common prosperity, meaning, in other words, we want things that are good for us all and opportunity, and we want peace in the world. And so you have to actually put metrics to those things. And then a reform of systems in which there is unity. So I want strong, middle, bipartisan that puts going to war with each other as a horrible perspective and that puts working together to try to achieve those metrics would be the thing that I would want most.
Sara.
I'm a numbers person, so I stand by the metrics, which is seeing politicians and those who are making consequential decisions for us all use numbers and facts to make decisions as opposed to...
Numbers and facts?
You asked for something easy, right?
Yeah.
It's tangible. Right. But actually, on a more serious note, I think seeing the US and China around the table again and having meaningful dialogue, I think can drive a lot of major changes in the world.
Patrice, one wish.
World-class technological education and skills in Africa and the developing world and the emerging markets, and a world that has a common future, common interests, common commitment, and common benefits.
Jamie, you get the last wish. My wand is ready.
Yeah, you know, my staff, whenever I come here, whispers when I come up on stage, you know, don't curse, don't make news, and they're probably very worried right now.
That's why you're laughing.
But I agree with what everyone said at the table, and I would just add, okay, that all these problems are solvable. It takes competent management. Stop listening to those damn echo chambers in people's ears. Sit down, do the work.
Ladies and gentlemen, may your wishes all become true. Thank you.